Good afternoon. This is Steve Armstrong from the State Department of Education, and we're hosting the first of a series of webinars on the Connecticut State Frameworks and on inquiry instruction in the social studies. I'm joined here, we're actually doing this from the offices of the State Department of Ed. I'm joined here by John Tully from Central Connecticut State University.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, go ahead, Steve. Yeah. And also with us will be Dave Basso, the president of Connecticut Council for the Social Studies, who's doing this because he just had a faculty meeting that ended. So he's doing this from Berlin High School, from his room there. So Dave, what you're going to have to do so I can get you talking is when you want to speak, just put it in the chat room that you want to speak, and I'll unmute your microphone. As I said, I think having done a few of these, the most efficient way to do this, I think, is rather than have people talking, is if you have a question anywhere along the way of this, please don't hesitate to ask it, because we want people, because this is, I mean, the stuff that we're going to talk about today is really basic stuff and important stuff for you to know if you're doing curriculum in your district, in your building, in your own classroom, or whatever. So, let's do this, that I'm just going to go through the PowerPoint, and this is a PowerPoint that's been given several times. And again, to repeat myself, any questions that you have, yeah, please type them in, and we'll do them. The new state frameworks, I guess we still call them new, were adopted by the State Board of Education in March of last year. Mm-hmm. And these, why did we even need frameworks? What are frameworks? Some of you that are veterans may have an old moldy copy of the last frameworks, and that we didn't have a framework document since 1998. So social studies teachers and curriculum leaders were asking, you know, what do we use? Some were using old versions. We had several draft versions. There were a couple groups in the last 10 years that did some work on the frameworks and never got it, they were never passed. So finally, last year, we have new frameworks. If you're looking for sort of the basis of the social studies frameworks and really want to get a little deeper into the weeds on inquiry and on the disciplines, I would suggest, and I know many of you are familiar with this document already, I would suggest going to the National C3 Social Studies Frameworks, the C3 meaning college, career, and civic life. And what we got from, we'll talk a bit more, but a lot of what we got from our frameworks, the basis of our work, a lot of it came from the C3 document. By the way, if you're looking for that or information about that, just go to the National Council for the Social Studies website, and there's plenty available of that, about that there. Since 1998, there's a lot that's been going on in social studies. Infinitely more primary sources are available than were available back then. There's also a revolution, as you know, in social studies pedagogy. Inquiry is not new, but inquiry is something that's gotten more emphasis since 1998. And as I said a minute ago, many teachers and social studies supervisors have said we need frameworks. You know, we're doing work in our districts, and we need something to go by. So for these reasons, I'm proud of the frameworks. I hope you, if you've seen them, are proud of them, because it's what they've done, by the way, have really put Connecticut on the map as far as social studies. They've been well received nationally, and so again, I'm proud of them, and I hope when you read them, you would be too. You want to know that the frameworks were not created by pie-in-the-sky educational reformer types, although some of them were on the committee. The frameworks were created by a team of Connecticut educators. If you go, I think, to page 5 of the frameworks, you can see who they were. They were written by university people, secondary school people, and from all different parts of the state. We had, before the frameworks were actually published, many people, many meetings, many emails where teachers were able to review and analyze and make comment on the frameworks. So we had quite an extensive review process before the frameworks were actually introduced and then passed by the State Board of Ed. It's important to know, and there's still a bit of confusion on this, that there's still a bit of confusion that, you know, people say, well, we're going to adopt the frameworks, or we're going to, you know, I would remind you that in a local control state like Connecticut, it's up to individual districts to use the frameworks as they see appropriate. That the state of Connecticut, unlike other states, there's some states where the state writes the curriculum, the teachers do, and the schools do the curriculum. Connecticut is not like that. Connecticut is a state where, to repeat myself, I'm proud of the frameworks, the writers are proud of the frameworks, but it's up to you fine folks, and in the districts you work with the teachers and the curriculum leaders in those districts, you're the ones that write the curriculum, and not Connecticut, not the state of Connecticut. And then there's still a bit of confusion about that, but just make sure that I would be honored if you'd use it as a guide, but it doesn't have to be word for word. Some districts have said, you know what, we're going to do the K-12 sequence that you suggest, but we're going to go on inquiry a little slow. To me, if that's a win. If you take part of the frameworks, fabulous, but you, it's up to your district to do what you think is best.
Yeah, the pace at which different districts are developing, this is John Tully again, the pace at which certain districts are developing curriculum has been really interesting. Steve's knows more about what different districts are doing around the state, but a few of the districts that I've been in, you know, they're often trying to, and if you're thinking about what you're going to do in your district or in your individual building, sometimes it's being driven by departments within buildings, middle school teams or middle schools in a district, just because they were the ones that were kind of the next step to get reviewed, are moving maybe a little more quickly than what's happening in elementary schools or in the high schools. But again, it's a matter of what's working for your district, where people's interests are, where some of the summer money might be to help put some things together. But I think overall, and I think Steve, you'd agree, the response from districts across the state has been tremendous. The number of participants we have on this webinar, the number of people that have been coming to the different workshops and you know, kind of events that we've had to kind of introduce the frameworks over the last year has been really impressive. So I think that bodes well for how teachers are seeing how it can be useful in their classrooms.
What are things that we really think are important from the frameworks? Okay, what do we really think are important? Well, first off, we think that social studies has got to be taught grades K through 12. That the skills the skills and the civic mindsets really that you need can't start in grade 6. You know, can't start in grade 5. That social studies has got to be taught from the earliest grades. Now, I'm totally aware that to think that districts in Connecticut, every district is going to do distinct social studies in elementary probably isn't going to happen. But what we really think is, even in an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach, that we should be teaching social studies in grade K to 5. And by the way, a cool thing that I've noticed in my work this year is I'm working this year far more with elementary school teachers than with secondary school teachers, which is a good sign. So a second thing that we would emphasize, and we're getting this from the C3, is that, you know what, a good social studies program, there's 4 major disciplines that all should be emphasized. Geography, history, civics, and economics. All of them are the core of a social studies education, and all should be included. Now, what we did when the frame, and by the way, some of the people who wrote the C3 would argue they should be equally included in all courses. We, as framework writers, didn't necessarily agree with that. What we did for each grade was to say that there's a major discipline for each grade, and the other disciplines are supporting disciplines. So we didn't quite agree totally with the C3 approach that all 4 would be equal.
One of the things we did also, if you look at if you have a chance to review them, or when you do, you'll see that we divided U.S. history into 3 grades, into 5th grade, 8th grade, and a high school class of U.S. history. And with the first class, the 5th grade class, moving from earliest peoples up through the Revolution. The 8th grade class, we're suggesting we go from the Revolution up through until about the 1890s, and that the high school class start there. And the reason we did that is because the majority of the committee felt that it was important to bring students as close to the present as possible. As we went around the room and we talked about how far, where people were going, we just weren't comfortable that people really weren't, as a rule, and certainly not in every place, but not moving much past often Vietnam would be the place where people would stop. And you'll see this as well when we talk about world history and world regional studies, that one of the overriding themes that we were concerned about, or issues that we wanted to be sure that were dealt with, is that students, when they leave Connecticut public schools, they have a good way to help understand the world as it is today. And so by dividing that into 3 years, we're hopeful that students will get a little bit, or be able to do inquiry, not to cover that material, but to do inquiry into some more recent events in the past. Which gets us to inquiry, and that the committee decided that inquiry should be the emphasized approach to social studies instruction. That doesn't mean that there's not room for other ways, but the organizing principle of what would happen in the social studies classroom would be inquiry, along the 4 dimensions as mentioned in the C3 document, that there's asking questions, that there's using disciplinary frameworks, that there's evaluating evidence, and then communicating conclusions and taking informed action, and that's the best way for students to become lifelong learners. So I'm going to let Steve go ahead, and I see we have a question, and I'll take a look at the question, and then we'll come back to that. So, Steve, you want to start from the next slide?
Yeah. Could we? There's a question that someone asked, and I think it was asked privately, so I won't tell who it is. But someone asked this question. I'd be curious to know your viewpoint on it. That, as you know, or some may not know, the new SAT asks for understanding of the founding documents. And that the writer, and I respect the viewpoint, is the writer writes they can't completely understand in the 5th grade. Do you think they remember the colonial era and American Revolution by the time they get to high school? So the question is it okay not to teach the American Revolution and the colonial era in high school because of the fact that for SAT they need the founding documents, and they may not remember the stuff from 5th grade? Would anybody care to comment on that? Do you think because we want kids to understand the founding documents, And because it's on the SAT, should we be teaching, should we start again in high school and teach from the founding fathers up until however far we get? Would anyone care to comment on that? Because this is an interesting point.
And while people might be typing in, let me kind of just give my view, and I don't want to speak for the committee, but maybe I'll kind of give a sense of what went into some of that consideration. I think at some level the basis of the question is, you know, the fifth graders can't understand much and they'll forget it later on. And that very well may be true, but that leaves us with another problem. Well, if fifth graders can't understand very much and they're going to forget it later on, we still should do something in fifth grade, I would say. I wouldn't think that anybody would say, well, you know what, fifth graders don't understand, they're going to forget it, so let's just not bother with fifth grade. And I think a deeper question goes to the sense of remembering things from the fifth grade and eighth grade and into high school. One of the things I didn't mention is that the big questions for those 3 grades in U.S. history about Connecticut's contribution, is America a land of opportunity? Those other big questions are repeated in 5th grade, 8th grade, and in modern U.S. history. So in that sense, those issues, those deep themes about the founding documents, about freedom, about constitutional government, the responsibilities of a citizen, are dealt with in all 3 of those different areas. And it would be hard, I would imagine, for a modern high school U.S. history class to deal with some of those issues without spending some time going back to some of the founding documents to get the sense of why those are important. So, so in that sense, I think those founding documents will come up over and over again, and they'll certainly come up again in a civics class in high school as well. The issue of remembering things, students don't remember a lot of things, but I think what they will remember are the skills to learn and how to answer big questions. Because if you answer the big questions, then there's a deeper sense that the learning is becoming your own. The learning is something that you are invested in. And I think that's going to work much better to have them understand and appreciate and get a sense of the meaning of these founding documents as we move forward.
I'm going to unmute for a second Dave Basso. And Dave, if you have any comments on this, on inquiry, or how you use inquiry, the importance of it you think of, or this issue of U.S. history, please join in. So Dave, I'm going to unmute you right now.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me.
We can from here.
Great. So the idea of inquiry that's really been undergirding the frameworks in a lot of ways when we've used it in our department and in my classroom to reflect some of these changes has really led to some very positive instructional shifts. And to incorporate the concern about the remembering the content, I would agree with John that having students ask questions and getting them throughout the course of a year and through the course of a couple of years ask more meaningful, deeper questions, that is what makes a lot of this work. I can tell you just today, for example, because we've gone through the process of having students asking their own questions about content and situating it within a particular segment of the curriculum, that as we worked with these questions, those questions that the students were asking, not the questions that I was asking, and while I may have modeled them earlier, but the questions that the students were asking were very deep questions that really became those essential, compelling, overarching questions. And so that in and of itself, to me, is a good reflection of what we want students to be able to do. So absolutely understand the concern about knowing the content, but I think this shift to inquiry is one way to get them to more deeply understand and to work with the content rather than just memorize and maybe regurgitate it in a very traditional setting.
Dave, I'm going to leave you unmuted, so feel free to add in as you see fit, okay?
Sure.
Could I also suggest, another interesting thing is our framework writers really thought it's important that U.S. history teachers get to the present day or to as close to the present day as they can. And you know what, unless you're far more skillful than many of us, to do U.S. history from the earliest inhabitants of North America to the present day so that we're covering everything, I'm not sure that that can be effectively done. So to me, getting us past the Vietnam War or the 1960s or something, to me, and I know some might disagree, to me that would trump the need to go back and teach, for some people for the third time, by the way, the colonial era. Inquiry is, it includes, if you go to the C3 or the state frameworks, it's called the inquiry arc, and there's 4 dimensions to the arc. One is asking questions. We want to ask, the term for in the inquiry arc is asking kids a compelling question. This is a question that doesn't have a yes or no answer. This is a question that needs research to be answered. Getting compelling questions are crucial to inquiry. You need to, in doing inquiry, you need to develop the skills of a historian, the skills of a geographer, or the skills of an economist by being able to create a plan and evaluate sources. Why is this primary source valuable? Why is this primary source not valuable? We need to be able to use the evidence we found to create a position, to take a stand on an historical or an economic or political issue, and then to present our stand, and whenever possible to take informed action, to take the learning out of just the classroom and to make it real life learning. John or Dave, I wonder if you might give an example that you could think of taking informed action that might come from an inquiry.
Dave, I'll let you take that.
Sure. So one of the, I think, misperceptions about what taking informed action means is that it has to be very much based on action where students are doing something out in the community or what have you, and that might be one aspect to it. But in a sense, it's some form of assessment. So writing a letter to the editor is taking informed action. Teaching other students in a jigsaw format is taking informed action. It's applying the newly acquired knowledge to a novel situation. A school fundraiser that emanates from some work that was done in a class about, I don't know, a human rights issue, some sort of informational dialogue that students might be able to have with each other or with the school or with the wider community, a capstone project. All of those examples, obviously some more extensive than others, but all of those are examples of students figuring out a way to communicate those conclusions in a way that is meaningful to them. And how that ties into inquiry is when we can create situations where students are developing and generating and refining their own questions to guide some sort of investigation, they take that much more ownership of it, and the engagement increases tremendously. And so if we're asking them to do some sort of product or some sort of outcome as a result of this research, however long or extensive it might be, they will be able to communicate those in any number of ways.
would anyone, I'd be curious to know, either someone has written in to me that if you're teaching, say, World Civ or Modern World History or something like that, what type of activities, Dave, because I know you've taught this course, what type of activities work for taking informed action for a World Civ teacher?
So I'm thinking something like having students maybe donate to Kiva, the microloan, the online microloan organization. That might be a great example. What we did in our course is we shifted, as a result of the frameworks and as a result of an emphasis on inquiry, we shifted to a more thematic approach, away from a regional approach. And so a unit that is, and we haven't gotten there yet, but a unit on, say, human rights and social justice would be very much fertile ground for moving towards something like that. Even something like our second unit was on religions and philosophies. And we didn't do this, but as some ideas are germinating here, visiting local religious organizations and institutions, that might be an example. Having students reach out to somebody to bring them into the classroom as a speaker, like, for example, an imam from a local mosque. Those are all examples of informed action. Unfortunately, what we're finding, and we'll need to continue to look at this, is that in a course like our grade 9 world history course, because much of it traditionally has been more of a survey orientation, we need to look at places where we can go much further into depth about certain topics and certain themes, and making it a thematic approach lends itself to inquiry. And we'll need to get to the point, and again, it's a work in progress, but we'll need to get to the point as well where we can find certain areas in those courses where we can take it a step further, and students can be doing more with that to communicate those conclusions.
And could I say that don't think in any way that inquiry is easy. I mean, it's a different role for teachers, but inquiry is something to create the right compelling questions. For example, in early grades, to help students with sources, to guide the right taking informed action. This is not an easy task. And I think if you're in a school or you're working in a place where not that many folks are doing inquiry, or you're just starting out, don't think you're going to turn into a model inquiry school in 2 months or something like that. I think just go slow with inquiry. I mean, what I've told districts is, maybe if you're just starting off, do one inquiry activity, that everybody that teaches a subject do one a quarter or something like that. Because to do this right, to create the compelling questions, is a hard thing. So, and I would just want to emphasize that you want to do it right, and it takes a while to do that. Here's just a couple examples of taking informed action. Our second grade group, our second grade teachers who made the second grade frameworks, said that at some very, very young level, that kids, the third day of school, sitting down with their teachers and making the rules for the year, is at that level taking informed actions. The Connecticut Council for the Social Studies is right now sponsoring a contest for middle school and elementary school classes on what makes our community special. Now, at the high school level, it may get political. I mean, and the interesting question, which different people do different ways, You know, do you want kids to get political in taking informed action? That would be a discussion for a later webinar, but it's something that you know, oddly enough, this was the part of the frameworks that actually got resistance from some folks in the political world who were uneasy with kids taking action in a direct way. So this taking informed action, I can assure you that the writers of the frameworks did not intend this to be, you know, going to the state capitol and holding a legislature hostage or something like this. It's things like, as was mentioned here, at the secondary level, food drives, going to meetings and things like that. Okay. Another pivotal thing that we think is important for the frameworks is that we want local history and Connecticut history to be part of this. That we would say in third grade and in the teaching of U.S. history in grades 5, 8 in high school, whenever you can, use local examples. Use what goes on in your town in Connecticut. And we're not suggesting, by the way, that this turn into a local history course or a Connecticut history course. But what we're suggesting is, when you can, to give students a sense of place, to use local examples. What happened in your town in World War II? What happened in your community in World War II? You know, there's a big monument probably in the center somewhere of your community. So just when you can, local and Connecticut history examples. And the other thing, and that I would really think is important, and our writers thought was important, that yes, we want kids to understand the past. That's critically important. But it's probably equally important that we allow our students to use history to help understand the present. And so thus the reason that we don't want our high school history classes ending with the Vietnam War or the 1960s, as so many of them do right now.
And the response we've been getting from Connecticut's historical societies and other places has just been tremendous. They're excited by the frameworks. I think we have several members of historical societies and local agencies on the call today, on the webinar today. This is an incredible opportunity for us to work with our partners in public history to bring those resources into the classroom. And that process has been going on and will continue to go on. Some people are writing in questions. Please be assured I'm writing them down, and then once we get through a little bit of this, as it makes sense, we'll put a couple of them together and we'll get to them. So we're seeing it.
What's wrong?
Here.
It's obvious that social studies and literacy are joined at the hip, that to be a good social studies student, one needs reading skills, writing skills, and research skills. And especially, we're going to have to, as I mentioned before, with the new SAT, students are going to have to be able to critically analyze. They have already, but another emphasis to critically analyze primary source documents. All that I worry about in some districts is that this be done, hopefully, in the service of social studies. In some districts, it's very discouraging if teachers get the sense that they're sort of helping the language arts teachers do this. That social studies is a strong enough discipline to stand on its own merits, and that we should be teaching literacy skills in the service of social studies and not just to help the language arts teachers when they're doing it.
So some of these next steps are things that we have already done, either the State Department of Education through Steve, or some of them in conjunction with the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies. The first is the creation of a companion document to flesh out some content inquiry assessment in more detail. One of the issues that, or one of the challenges we faced writing the frameworks is some districts were hoping for a very extensive document that would list a lot of compelling questions and almost provide almost mini units. Other districts were hoping for just some broad outline and the ability and the freedom to have those teachers put it together. So I think we've developed, we hope, a fairly happy medium that fits everyone in the state, but the companion document that we're pulling through now is going to have some elements for each of the grade levels, some special topics as well to allow people to flesh things out in a little more detail. Over the past year, we've done these workshops around the state. The webinar series is an addition to that. We're going to be offering more moving forward. The webinar series obviously is what we have going. And 6 to 8 districts are working on creating a model curriculum. One of our participants wrote in, you know, is there a list of compelling questions that districts have already tried? One of the great advantages that we have, as Steve mentioned, is that we are the first state in the nation to take this approach to fully implement C3. One of the challenges, though, however, is there's not a whole lot out there. But it gives us the opportunity to create some of this. And these districts that are working this together, Steve's meeting with them this week and later on. As those elements come forward of some model inquiries, we're going to find ways to get those up on the State Department website and be sure that we share them in a variety of different venues moving forward. So we're hoping that that will help people as they begin to see some examples that are working in Connecticut around our new frameworks. We had 2 workshops last summer. We have 2 additional workshops this coming summer. The school video competition, Why Our Community is Special, is moving forward. And I think some of that, the news of that already gone out, Steve? Mm-hmm. Yep, so news of that has gone out. If you want more information, please let Steve know. And we have a team of people, not only Steve, but people from the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies who are doing work in individual districts. And so that's something we think is very, has been very helpful. It gives, as all of you know, the chance for teachers to sit down together and talk among themselves about how this would work in your particular school environment, in your particular district. All that becomes real important. So those are ongoing, and we'll continue to have those moving forward.
Jennifer could you, if I unmute you, could you just talk about the Understanding by Design workbook that you just wrote in about? Are you there, Jennifer?
I'm here.
You're using how do you find UBD, Understanding by Design, to work in conjunction in social studies and with the social studies frameworks? Have you got deep enough into it to be able to comment on that?
I've used UBD in Stratford and then also now in my district of Camden. And it's definitely a good starting point for teachers to see samples of larger questions. I think teachers are really focused on topical questions. So this is a nice way for them to get bigger, broader questions into the document.
Thank you. And what we would strongly suggest is that what we call compelling questions, and you can go, these are the questions that guide inquiries. These would be very, very broad questions. These would be questions, I mean, examples that are given. Was the Revolutionary War truly revolutionary? did the civil rights movement increase the power and political abilities of Black Americans? These are questions that we hope would force kids to do some sort of deep dive research. But we also think, if you look at the frameworks, that sometimes to get at those questions, that you can't just have a kid do, was the Revolutionary War revolutionary, without some content knowledge first. So the content knowledge, if you look at our framework document, we call those questions, and for every inquiry we have listed there, we have these two, we call those questions supporting questions. That we think that before you actually get to the compelling questions, that you must access the supporting questions. And you get the back one? Yeah. And those supporting questions are sort of the content that you need before you get there. And we missed the, can you go back a few, John? We missed the one with the sequence. Is the sequence there somewhere?
No, I don't think it is.
Okay, it's not on here?
No.
Okay. All right, it's not on this website. I apologize, but if you look in the frameworks, let me just very briefly, because I think some of you would want this, what we would suggest as a K-12 sequence. Our grade K, start social studies grade K with the question is, what is a, what is a community? Why do we need communities? What's the point of us living in communities? That's the concepts we'd start in grade K. We'd start in grade K with some map skills. But you know what, we know how far we get? Let's do a map of our classroom. Let's do a map of our building. Okay, we're starting with that. In economics, what can we do in grade K? What's the difference between what we want and what we need? So those are the kind of things we start in grade K. In grade 2, in grade 1, we would build on the theme of making of a community, but what we would be talking about there would be sort of what's our role in the community, who are important people in our community, what do they have, what are their jobs. So it's increasing with more complexity on not just community in general, but starting to talk about the community that the student lives in. Grade 2, making a difference. Starting to study in a grade 2 appropriate format, the biographies of people who have made a difference. Not just the people who are national or international, but also who in Connecticut makes a difference, who in your local community makes a difference, and introducing to those grade 2 students the concept that we can all make a difference. And we're not all going to be Gandhi, or we're not all going to be Mother Teresa maybe, but that we can all make a difference in society. Grade 3, we would emphasize Connecticut history, the beginning of the study but more importantly, the study of our community. It's amazing how many third grade students, and quite candidly, how many adults have very little knowledge of the history of their own community. Third grade, we think, is a place to start with that. And not just the history of our community, but who lives in our community? Where do people that live in our community work? Do they stay in our community? Do they go work somewhere else? So really, we think grade 3, some Connecticut history, but even more than that, local history, your community's history. And by the way, this in many this is done in many districts before the frameworks even came along, in cooperation with local historical societies. Grade 4, but I apologize, but it's amazing in grade 3 that's when students actually realize that some event of importance actually happened in their own community. To some students, this is quite a revelation. Grade 4, we start to talk about geography, and we focus on U.S. geography. And as the teachers that are listening to this know, geography is a difficult subject for many students. You know, I mean, I jokingly say a kid could be taught, you know, latitude and longitude 10 times, and you could teach it at 11, and sometimes it's starting from ground zero. But, you know, and our writers thought, by the way, that before kids got into U.S. history, that they needed geography, and that's why it's put in grade 4. As we talked about a few minutes ago, we would propose that U.S. history be divided in grade 5, in grade 8, and in high school. Just to repeat myself, I apologize. Grade 5 would be early U.S. history up to the Revolutionary War, we would propose. And many districts, by the way, do exactly that right now. Grade 8, we would propose that it go from the Revolutionary War up through the Civil War, up past Reconstruction, and into post-Civil War westward expansion. There are districts, in fairness, that do early U.S. history in 5th grade and do it over again in 8th grade. Remember, our goal in high school is to get past Vietnam, so we would propose not doing that. Grade 6 and 7, many of your schools that you teach in, if you're a teacher, grade 6 or 7 or both, does ancient world history, which is a fine and valuable course. The writers, however, of our grade 6 and 7 curriculum, their suggestion and their ideas were, if we're going to do China for the sake of argument, it's more important, and again, this could be a debatable thing, but our writers thought it's more important that kids know about China today than they do about the ancient dynasties. And I think, so our approach in grade 6 and 7 is a regional studies approach. In 2 years, take 6 to 7 to 8 regions of the world and look at them through the lens of what's the geography of the region? What's the economic patterns and systems of the region? What's the governments of the region? And then don't give up on history, but that the history that would be taught would be what history helps us understand the region today, right? Would some of that be ancient history? Would some of that be the Han Dynasty? Absolutely. But would some of it be if we're doing China, the Communist Revolution, the one-child policy, recent economic developments in China? Absolutely. So, so this is a fairly fundamental change that we're suggesting for 6 and 7, the regional studies approach. Quite frankly, this is the one where we've got a bit of teacher blowback on, that the teachers who are teachers of ancient world. High school, we would suggest, again, and grade 8 is that second stage of U.S. history. High school, we would suggest the 3rd year of U.S. history that gets you as close to the present as we can. We would suggest in high school a modern world history class there was, by the way, tremendous debate on where a U.S. history class should start. Dave Basso was part of that. Dave, you were part of those discussions on modern world history. I'm wondering if you could talk briefly about that.
Right. So part of the conversation, and it was very rich, of course, was, how do you establish a starting date with the understanding that we should bring it up to and include as many current events as possible, and obviously to make it relevant and meaningful for students and their understanding of the world today. But the fact of the matter is that some decision has to be made. And Steve had alluded to this, just to make the point that just by starting it in the industrial era does not preclude us from incorporating other aspects of the past. For example, any sort of compare and contrast might be much richer if you provide a longer historical context. So, for example, in our own course here where I teach, we certainly still include some of the earlier history, but we're using it to inform more recent events. And so while there's a starting point per se, it's kind of a soft starting point, and we make sure that we situate it in a much broader historical context.
Thanks, Dave. The other thing is high school. We propose, what we propose and how it is the one semester course that presently exists and will continue to exist in American government. And what the writers of that course propose is that you make that course as active a course as you possibly can. That this is, and by the way, this mirrors what a lot of people who study civics on the national level say. And this could be a whole nother debate and a whole nother webinar. But some people who study civics say that we're too worried about, if we want kids to be citizens, if that's the goal, that we're too worried in our government classes and maybe our education as a whole of teaching kids about government, that we should be doing more to encourage students to take action civically. And that's the kind of thing that our writers of our high school American government course propose, is have kids participate, have kids taking informed action, have kids going to town meetings. By the way, I had John, I got to ask you this question. I had a teacher just ask, I've had a couple teachers ask, if we want to have our kids write letters to government officials, do we actually have to send them? What would be your response to that?
Wow, that's a great question.
Do we actually have to send them? Is it enough just to write the letter?
Well, I think there is some value in having students do that process, so they know if this is how you would do it, this is how you would put it together. So I don't think that there is anything wrong with having them write the letter and just give it to the teacher, and then that's something that they've practiced doing. But I think taking it that extra step and actually sending it allows people to get a feel that it's possible for them to do. And the sense that civic action is that they've done it, that they've practiced it. You know, one of the things I talk to my students who are going to be your peers is, you know, oftentimes history and social studies teachers self-select into ways that we were taught. You know, I remember sitting in a high school classroom and having a social studies teacher say, you know, when we got to the government section or the government class, you know, here there are 435 representatives and there are 100 senators, and I was writing it all down thinking this is just the greatest thing in the world. But we often don't think about our peers and colleagues who felt that was a complete turnoff about government. They didn't see any point in it. They didn't see how it could be useful or important in their lives, and we see the consequences of that all around us. So, so I think having students do things is much better than having them not do things. We're conscious of time. I do want to let people know that Dave reminded us that the link for the video contest that we talked about is on the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies website, and that address is ctsocialstudies.org. ctsocialstudies.org. The link for information about the video, the link for a lot of other important things, and if you're not a member, now's the time to do that. It's ctsocialstudies.org.
Could I just quickly answer a couple of questions that were raised? Someone asked about when should modern world be taught. I mean, we don't take a stance on that. I mean,
other than being in high school.
Other than it should be a high school course, but the grade is up to you. Some people have asked, by the way, why not have it like instead of 5, 8, and why not have it like 7, 8? You know, why have it spread out like we have it spread out, 5, 8 in high school? My standard answer is, and I think the committee felt, that U.S. history is important enough that it should be taught in all 3 grades. There should be U.S. history in elementary, in middle, and high, and that's the reason for that. There is another question from someone. Would there be an official state requirement for world history? The state actually, I think, if anything, is going away from that approach of requiring anything. There is, as you may know, a committee that's looking at graduation requirements and what high schools, specifically high schools, are supposed to offer. Their report will be out shortly, and I think that will indicate, that will, for some kids, that report will be out soon, and perhaps we can discuss that at one of our later webinars.
From the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies perspective, we're keeping an eye on that. As soon as that task force submits its report to the Education Committee in the General Assembly, it'll be posted on their website. Once that happens, we'll be certain to let all our members know about where that is, what it looks like, and then we can see, we can discuss the impact of that on social studies across the state.
Someone emailed me or sent me this note, and this is great. Simulations are, if we want, simulations are a great way to get kids involved in practice civic activities as well. Just so you know what's upcoming for social studies, and all of this is on the CCSCSS website, ctsocialstudies.org. A couple things. This webinar series, by the way, these will be archived, and you will get an email tomorrow if you or colleagues want to hear this again, or you want to have somebody else hear it. You'll get an email tomorrow on how to do that. We are having a state conference on March 24th on inquiry and the assessment of inquiry. Information on that will be going out shortly. We're going to be having 2 more webinars in May and June. One on the Middle East and terrorism, and another one on teaching the 2016 elections. Those events, those webinars are upcoming. We will once again have summer workshops this summer, one in June, one in August, and finally, Central Connecticut State University, for probably U.S. history teachers, is sponsoring a field experience trip in late June into early July, going to Mississippi, Memphis, Tennessee, talking with folks from the civil rights movement. Very, very interesting trip, and we hope U.S. history teachers would be interested in that. So those are all upcoming events. You could hear about them you could read about them on the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies website. If you have specific questions on anything, please contact me, stephen.armstrong@ct. And that is the end of today's session. We'll have another one in 2 weeks, and the next webinar session will be on inquiry. So thanks an awful lot, and we hope this was valuable for you today. Thank you very much.